10 years, Ross and I have visited each other in Australia and in Japan, talking about various things as we shared each other's delicious local foods, wine, and sake. It is therefore very sad for us that the COVID-19 pandemic has kept us from traveling abroad freely and meeting in person over the last year. I sincerely hope that the situation will improve soon. Now in Fukushima, spring is approaching as it did 10 years ago. And although there is still snow in high mountains and the potential for snow in the cities, the buds of spring flowering trees are swelling. Next slide, please. Among the awaited blooms, cherry blossoms are the most highly anticipated. The cherry blossoms are in full bloom in Tokyo last week. But as the temperature is lower in Fukushima, which is located 205 kilometers north of Tokyo, it will take another week to see the cherry blossoms here in their prime. Cherry blossoms, or sakura, has always been a spiritual flower for the Japanese people and continues to occupy a special position in modern consciousness. Since the petal begins to fall only a week after the tree is in full bloom, it was once regarded as a metaphor of samurai warriors who valued a beautiful, honorable death. The transience of cherry blossoms permeates the Japanese soul, reflecting the ideas of the philosopher-poet Takaaki Ryume Yoshimoto. In response to the ideological crisis facing Japan toward the end of World War II, when many Japanese young people sadly lost their lives, Yoshimoto proposed the idea of the shared illusion of life. This is an idea I will return to in the context of the events of the last decade. Next slide, please. 10 years ago, a magnitude of 9.0 earthquake and a tsunami with a maximum run-up height of 40.1 meters struck East Japan, primarily affecting Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima prefectures, which are located in the Pacific side of northern Honshu, the main island of Japan. More than 22,000 people died or are missing, and 40,000 people are still displaced from their hometown communities, forced to endure the difficulties of life as an evacuee. Infamously, the tsunami destroyed a nuclear power plant facing the Pacific Ocean located in Fukushima. 10 years ago, 1 month after the disaster began, the cherry blossoms in Fukushima were in full bloom. Even with our hometown communities devastated, the surviving cherry trees blossomed. The juxtaposed ferocity and tenderness of nature reminded me of a Chinese poet Du Fu's poem, View in Springtime. Next slide, please. Yes, the country is smashed, hills and rivers remain. The city turns to spring, plants and trees grow deep. Moved by the moment, flowers splash tears. Resentful of parting, birds startle the heart. The one slide before, please. Look at the smiles of these children, who 10 years ago were primary school students in Minamisoma City, located on the Fukushima Pacific coastline. After the disaster, through the continued trauma they experienced, including the loss of their families, friends, and homes, and subsequent multiple displacement. They forgot how to smile. But thanks to Australia-Japan Society Queensland and the teachers at school in Brisbane, who, upon my request, kindly found Australian pen pals for them and translated the children's letters into both languages. The children were smiling again. Imagine how much joy and encouragement I got from their smiles. I'm very pleased to learn from the recent AJS Queensland newsletter that this project, Exchanging Letters, evolved into the subsequent 1,000 Parcels of Love project, which was undertaken in conjunction with the Australian-Japan Foundation. I'd like to take this opportunity to give my heartfelt thanks to all the people who supported these projects. Thank you very much. 10 years have since passed, and these children are already 20 years old. I wonder what they have been going through. What are they doing now? What have their experiences over the past 10 years been like? Next slide, please. The one slide before, yes. Every year, as March 11th approaches in Japan, TV programs and newspaper articles related to the Great East Japan earthquake increase. As this year was the 10th anniversary of the disaster, many more programs, news, articles, and magazines featured the 10th anniversary. If you include the coverage on social media platforms, it was a huge amount of interest. Whilst watching the programs and reading the articles, I found myself getting uncomfortable with the narrative reported by some of them. It seems to me that many media outlets expect that victims to have overcome the difficulties and to be living life with positively 10 years later. They expect the disaster-stricken areas to be restored by now and are reporting according to their expected storylines. However, I don't think their expectations reflect the lived experience and the reality of the victims and the affected areas well. Another TV program I watched featured a young victim who lost her family in the tsunami 10 years ago. She said, "For 5 years after the disaster, I was a cheerful and innocent girl, despite my vague knowledge about what had happened to my family. I laughed normally and played joyfully with friends. However, as an evacuee, when I behaved that way, the students at my new school and TV people who came to interview me looked embarrassed. They said to me, 'You are not like a victim. You are too cheerful.' As I experienced that over and over again, I became the sad-looking girl without laughter that they expected to see. The victim should look sad. The disaster area should look chaotic. After the catastrophe, the victim lived to the best of their ability. So many sufferings compounded by painful, depressing experiences have made them forget to smile. After 10 years, those victims have regained their smile and can positively talk about the result of the reconstruction. Many people tend to have such a shared illusion about the victims and the disaster area upon the 10th anniversary. It is sad to say that many people in Fukushima have been confused and sometimes frustrated by the gap between that illusion and the reality we face. One Fukushima man said, "It's been 10 years, but nothing has changed. Since the disaster, the time has stopped." Next slide, please. It has been difficult to live under uncertainty after the disaster, especially in Fukushima, where the damaged nuclear power plant added to uncertainty in our lives. As a Japanese, the experience of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is familiar, and we can refer to reports of nuclear accidents such as at Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. But this situation was very different. The amount of radiation emitted into the air was orders of magnitude lower. Nevertheless, the social and psychological damage has been enormous. The trouble is that there is little scientific evidence about the long-term effects of very low-dose radiation on the human body and mind. The national government and the Fukushima Prefecture government together launched a thyroid cancer screening by ultrasonography for children in Fukushima in October 2011 as part of the Fukushima Health Management Survey. Thyroid ultrasound examinations have been provided to all the children aged 18 years or younger who lived in Fukushima at the time of the accident. The target population is about 380,000 people. More than 80% of children have participated in the survey. Iodine accumulates in the thyroid gland, which sits above the collarbone on the front of the neck. 10 years ago, radioactive iodine was released in the air by a hydrogen explosion in the power plant reactor building, and potentially taken up into the thyroid glands of those in the area, which could lead to cancer developing later. A long-term study into the number of thyroid cancers developing after the disaster in children who are more sensitive to radiation than adults was important to provide insights into the health hazards of this type of radiation exposure. For the study which is ongoing, it was preferable to follow up as many Fukushima children for as long as possible. That was the motivation of the scientists. On the other hand, people in Fukushima wanted to know if their children had cancer due to the nuclear accident. And if they had cancer, they wanted it to be found earlier and treated as soon as possible. These were the circumstances under which the thyroid cancer screening program was initiated. It was an unprecedented program involving the performance of thyroid ultrasonography on many asymptomatic children in the prefecture after the nuclear accident. It was as if the research needs of the scientists and the interest of alleviating the anxieties of the people in Fukushima were aligned. Unfortunately, however, a significant number of abnormal findings were found, and a close examination revealed that more than 100 children have a possible or confirmed carcinoma malignancy. This has caused an enormous amount of anxiety and confusion among people in Fukushima. Many people's lives have changed as a result, living day to day with the psychological burden accompanied by pessimism about their future. Most thyroid cancers are slow to progress and have a good prognosis with considerable latency. They usually go unnoticed unless they are screened and discovered by chance. However, in a small proportion of cases, they can lead to life-threatening advanced cancer. It is difficult to distinguish those in this group, which require immediate treatment that in itself has burdens and side effects. It is also uncertain whether these cancers were caused by the radiation exposure 10 years ago, as the cancers may well have developed regardless of the accident. It is a big controversy politically as well as scientifically as to whether this thyroid cancer screening has resulted in overdiagnosis and potentially unnecessary harmful treatments. Reflecting on this situation, I think in order to address the anxiety of people in Fukushima, it was necessary to listen to their concerns in a person-centered manner, utilizing a shared decision-making approach coupled with an informed discussion on the nature of thyroid cancer. Next slide, please. Oh, the few slides back, please. One more, yes. What happened at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant 10 years ago was that reactor overwhelmed by tsunami lost all power, including the power to cooling mechanisms, leading to precarious situation on the verge of nuclear meltdown. There are 50 people, later respectively called Fukushima 50, made up of the plant director and workers, most of whom were local Fukushima people. They stayed behind in the destroyed nuclear power plant, working hard to cool and decompress the reactor to minimize nuclear contamination in the surrounding area. Japanese film titled Fukushima 50, based on Ryuki Kassai's detailed interviews with the people involved, was released in March last year. Unfortunately, the number of people able to watch it at the cinema was limited due to the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Setsuro Wakamatsu received the Best Director Award, and Ken Watanabe, who played the nuclear power plant director, received the Best Supporting Actor Award of the Japan Academy Film Award this year. However, criticism of the film by critics published in the influential Japanese film magazine Kinema Junpo was harsh. Next, please. This work evokes agitation, anger, and confrontation, not verification, mourning, or solidarity. And another critics, it's like a war masterpiece that depicts the indignation of subordinates who showed their spirit of self-sacrifice when sent to the front line by incompetent superiors. Moreover, in the end, I was amazed at the development that beautified Japan after World War II to show the people's tears at the cherry blossoms in full bloom while ignoring their responsibility for the accident. The tragic performance has to be fake. The conflict between political intention and humanism has been portrayed only superficially. They despised nature. That's the only conclusion. this film is not worth watching in 2020. I must disclose that I'm biased as a victim of the disaster in Fukushima myself, but I think their criticism would have changed if they had been in the field and sensed the reality we lived. Next slide, please. This leads me on the final part of my talk, where I consider some of the personal risks immediately following the disaster. Ideally, for crisis management, safety should be considered thoroughly and reasonably, and we should be well prepared for all possible hazardous events. However, this is not always feasible, especially when something unprecedented like a nuclear accident happens. In such a case, when there is work that someone has to do, it should be done no matter how unreasonable or risky it may seem. At the beginning of April 2011, I was sent on a mission from the anti-disaster headquarters of Fukushima Prefecture government. The mission was to take command on the operation to find and take care of the people who were unable to evacuate and were left behind in the zone between 20 kilometer and 30 kilometer from the damaged nuclear power plant. As we didn't have sufficient information or records about the health condition of the local residents, we had to visit each house in the community to see if anyone has left, if anyone was left, how they were doing, and then connect them to medical care as needed. By the end of the 2-week operation, we had found and taken care of about 400 left behind people, most of whom were frail, elderly, and or disabled. 4 people were admitted to the hospital. At the time, there must have been criticism that the operation was reckless and inefficient, as we were then neither fully informed nor properly equipped to address potential nuclear hazards. But I thought someone had to do it. I was incredibly grateful to the members of the self-defense force, individuals much younger than I, whose support, cooperation, and devotion underpinned the operation. Next slide, please. Looking back over the past 10 years, there seem to be gaps everywhere. The gaps exist, those who help and those who are helped, between those who report and those who are reported about, between those who investigate and those who are investigated, and between those who criticize and who are criticized. I think it is important for us to better navigate these gaps in order to understand each other better. Our background, intention, and illusion are all different. It is difficult to completely overcome the gap, and which side of the gap you find yourself on may change in an instant. Nevertheless, my experience have taught me that we can still communicate to bridge the gaps between us. The circumstances through which person lives day to day varies from person to person. I'd like to build a future grounded in context, not buying into the illusion, but sharing the reality of other people as much as possible. The world has been, is, and will be full of disasters, earthquakes and tsunami, conflicts and wars, bushfires and floods, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is a particularly tough one. As I conclude my reflections on the 10 years since the Great East Japan earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear disaster, I want to leave you with a final thought. The people who was helped yesterday may be helping someone in another context tomorrow. I wish good health to you all and I hope you stay safe. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Thank you, Professor Kassai. That was wonderful. Very moving and wonderful. Yeah. Don, would you like to ask Professor Kassai a question or?
Yes, if I may. Ryuki-san, thank you so much for that poignant and compelling presentation. You touched on a very important point about the gaps that occurred and how important it is to bridge those gaps. And much research in community medicine is about the connectedness between people and communities that promotes health. So the question I ask is, what special initiatives is Japan doing to promote that connectedness between not only the survivors, but others who are able to help perhaps from other regions? And what impact do you think that could have?
Thank you very much, Don, for this question. This is a very important question. If I may, I'd like to say that the primary care in Japan is still under development, and also the research in the field of primary care conducted in the community is also very little numbers. But still, we try to cooperate with researchers in public health, as well as some other disciplinaries like visiting nurses and so on. And we just started to conduct some research in the communities. I hope those research projects will reveal some importance of connectedness between people and communities.
Thank you.
Ryuki, when Professor Staines and myself went and we visited the Hosei Yoroku Clinic, the Kitakata Center for Family Medicine, and the Hobaru Chuo Clinic. How are they going today, and what changes have occurred 10 years on?
Thank you very much for this question. So they have been doing very well, and over the past 10 years, they have graduated the several GP trainees to become the GP specialist now, working in the prefecture. And so now they are busy prepared for the COVID-19 vaccination programs ahead of us. So since then, not the dramatic change have happened, but still we are doing very well.
Oh, that's good. Just a follow-up question. I know post the disaster, you had trouble encouraging registrars to come from other parts of Japan to Fukushima. Is that a little bit easier now?
It's difficult to say, but as far as I am concerned, I sense that still the young medical students and the trainees, if they are asked to choose either the training programs in Fukushima or other prefectures, then probably the majority would take the programs in other prefectures. But yeah, I would say that Fukushima program is the nice one, so the worth coming and being trained.
Of course it is. The other, I've got a follow-up as well. I mean, Fukushima, for those who haven't been there, was also the food bowl of Japan, wasn't it, at one stage? And they also have an amazing sake, which has touched my lips. I know that they're still struggling, even though they're probably the most tested produce in the world. They're still struggling to overcome the problems of 10 years ago.
I think the influence by the COVID-19 pandemic has been enormous, and much enormous than the influence of the accident 10 years ago. So we are not allowed to have a big party outside of our house. So I don't think the sake well sold in the major hotels and convention centers, unfortunately.
Mm. Well, we'll have to encourage more exports to Australia, I think.
Yes, please.
Just finally, before I hand it over to Margaret, it's an honour to be your friend, and it's always incredibly moving when I hear the story. So thank you for all the work that you're doing over there, and looking forward to seeing you on a face-to-face basis. So
thank you very much.
I'll pass it over to Margaret now.
I've just got one question, Ryuki. You mentioned earlier that the Australia-Japan Society, that you'd assisted us reach out to the school students in Fukushima, the 100 students, which was then followed by the 1,000 passes of love. And then we're also involved in the funding of a mobile library for residents and students. And I think all of the students that we dealt with were between the age of about 7 and 15. And as you also mentioned before, they're all young adults now. And I was wondering, these young adults who were students at the time of the disaster, are they choosing now to move away, or are they choosing to stay and make a future in Fukushima and other affected areas in eastern Japan?
I don't have the precise numbers where they're going, but there's in terms of education, there's no good high school or colleges. So the number of those schools are very few. So the students, I think they have to move to the larger city to attend colleges or universities.
So Ross and Don, if you've got any other comments you'd like to make before I officially.
If I may, Margaret, just one comment, really. Ryuki, I read that following the disaster, a number of companies had been virtually destroyed, including one was a soy sauce manufacturing company. And one of their competitors arranged to have their secret recipes and the ingredients and additional equipment moved over to their competitor to build them up again. And I thought that was a wonderful demonstration that went above the usual competitive business interests, and one that ensured the viability of the community and the people who work there and of the industry itself. So it shows the resilience in a community that's able to produce such wonderful support for each other at a time of great disaster.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comment. Yeah. But I would like to thank you, Australia-Japan Society, Queensland, to help us from far over the such a distance. But your help made us very happy and smile. Thanks again.
Well, Ryuki, on behalf of the Australia-Japan Society of Queensland, and on behalf of all of those who've joined us tonight throughout Australia and from Japan, I'd like to thank you for your participation in this evening's event. I know you're extremely busy, and we're most appreciative of you sharing your time and your comments with us this evening. Don, I'd also like to thank you for joining us, and Ross. And I think in closing, as we sit here in Brisbane, in Queensland, in yet another COVID lockdown, we're reminded of the depth of the relationship between Australia and Japan, and the strength and the resilience of our citizens to overcome the greatest of challenges. Safe in the knowledge that while we may be separated at the moment, we're all members of the greater Australia-Japan family, and that we share and we celebrate the good times and we support one another in the tough times. And we
Well said, Margaret.
Thank you. And we wish the people of Fukushima and elsewhere in Eastern Japan continued renewal, and we look forward to the day in the not too distant future when we can visit one another again. But until then, thank you again, Ryuki, and thank you all for joining this evening's event. Please stay safe. Good night.
Thank you very much for having me here. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.